Hey there, this is Ross Izzard, and this is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing at High-Alpine lakes. Last week, we did a rundown of how to time your trips to High-Alpine lakes, which seems like it should be easy, but actually, as you could probably tell from last week's episode, is more complicated than you might think. You have to be thinking about time of year, whether or not the ice is off, whether or not the cutthroat in those lakes are trying to spawn, or if you're going to target brookies instead, if there's too much snow to access some time of day, weather, yada, 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 yada. There's a lot that goes into picking which lakes you're going to go to, and then timing those trips so that you can go and be safe and successful, which of course is always the goal of what we're doing here with this backcountry fly fishing thing that you know and love. But once you get to the lake, you also need to know how to catch fish. And so this week's episode is all about how to do that. And you may think, look, you pack all your stuff up there. You brought your rod, you brought your reels, you brought your net, you packed for self-reliance like we talked about a couple weeks ago, and you're like ready to rock. And you're a kick-ass fly fisherman, so of course you're going to catch fish, right? Because you're awesome. Except that that's not really how it works. High-Alpine lakes are an enigma for many anglers, me included, for a lot of years. You can reliably put me on a trout stream, big, small, medium-sized, whatever, creek, river, doesn't matter. I can pretty much guarantee you that I'm going to be able to catch fish there because they're fairly predictable, right? There are some exceptions, like you could have runoff or there could be some environmental condition that's messing it up. I mean, there are streams that occasionally pose a challenge, but in general, and I know this sounds kind of cocky, but I bet a lot of you have had the same experience. Once you figure out how to fish moving water, you just know how to fish moving water, right? You can read the water like a book, and we'll talk more about that at some other point, but you know where the fish are. I mean, you can show me a picture, I can tell you where to fish. You can walk me up to a stream, I can tell you where to fish. And if there are fish in there, chances are pretty good that they are going to be doing what you think they're going to be doing. If you get pretty close with the fly selection, which again, you just kind of figure out over the course of time, you're probably going to catch fish reliably enough that during, peak fly fishing season, when the water is warm and the fish are active, I don't really worry about getting skunked in streams that have fish in them. I mean, could I get skunked in a stream that doesn't have fish in them because I went out blue lining and picked the wrong blue line? Yeah, I suppose that could happen. But for the most part, I know how it's going to go, and it's going to go with some fish in my net. High lakes are not like that. Sometimes you can go to a high lake. I've had days, in fact, last summer I had a day at a really beautiful lake that I bushwhacked into in a wilderness area, not too far from Denver, as a matter of fact. Took me a while to figure out the route. Took me a while to map it out. Took me forever to get over there because I had to mark it out and make sure I didn't get myself lost in the woods. Got there and just absolutely crushed it. It was the best day of lake fishing I've ever had. I caught 50 or 60 cutthroat out of that lake over the course of 5 or 6 hours. I mean, it was incredible. There are other lakes, though, that I've gone to where I haven't touched a fish all morning or all day if I happen to be there all day. There are lakes that I'll go to one year and I'll catch a bunch of really beautiful fish, and then I'll go back the following year and I swear there are no fish in the lake. And that might be true. Some of those lakes do winter kill. But in general, these lakes are deep enough that the fish are probably surviving, and that means that there's something else going on. We don't get to use the random excuse of, well, there were no fish in there, right? Which you see on some of the reviews. People go up these lakes and go, no fish in there, don't bother. No, probably not. You were probably just doing it wrong. And so we're going to talk today about how to do it right, or at least how to do the closest approximation to right that I can give you. Because here is the cold water, pun intended. Sometimes there just isn't a right at high lakes. The conditions can be wrong. Temperatures can be wrong. There are a whole bunch of things that can happen, some of which I think I can maybe guess at or explain, a lot of which I can't. Sometimes it's just not going to happen for you, and you got to be prepared for that when you hike up to these lakes. Just put it in your head out of the gate. You're not guaranteed to catch fish ever anywhere, including streams, but definitely at high lakes it can get very, very challenging. And so this is not necessarily a cheat code, right? I'm not handing you the golden book of secrets. I can't promise that you're going to catch a fish every single time you go out, but this is an accumulation of my knowledge after hiking many dozens, maybe more than that, high alpine lakes, and fishing them with varying degrees of success, ranging from incredible Yahoo, take lots of pictures, to what the hell am I doing with my life, and walking back down the mountain slowly with my head held low in shame. Although that's a good reminder for you that here's your tip going way back to an earlier season. If anybody ever asks you how you did on the way down, you see them on the trail, the answer is always, yeah, I did all right. Doesn't matter if you caught 50 fish or 0 fish. You just did all right. There's no reason. They don't need to know, right? We're fly fishermen. You can fudge it a little bit. So this is not the be all end all, but it is the stuff that I know about fishing high lakes. And it's the way that I fish high lakes with enough success that I feel confident in it to the point where I continue doing it. And I suppose that's not a ringing endorsement, but it's the best endorsement I can give you because I don't do things that don't work, or at least I try not to. In fishing, in my regular life, it's it's an open question, definition of insanity there. But when it comes to fishing, I prefer things that actually work. And as a result, this is what I found to actually work enough of the time for me to keep using it on a reliable basis. So we're going to split this episode into 3 parts. The first one is gear, the second one is flies, and the third one is tactics. And I'm going to run through each of them. I'm not going to get too crazy on it. We'll probably do whole episodes on certain aspects of this at some point in the future, but I do want to give you kind of a something to go off of when you go up to these lakes and start fishing. Because I know a lot of you, especially here in the West, spend a lot of time hiking these lakes. Of course you do. You have a very short window from really like early July until maybe the beginning of September. So you're going to spend a lot of time chasing them. I know I do. And I want to make sure you got something in your pocket when you go. All right, so let's start with gear. And we're not going to talk about all the gear that you need to like hike places, right? You can go back and listen to the earlier episode this season about packing for self-reliance. That'll tell you what I have in my day pack to go up to these lakes. Some of them are far enough that I have to bring a backpacking bag and camp. That's a different thing that we'll get into at a different point. But if you want to know about the general gear, the safety gear that you need to go and do remote lakes by yourself, you should go back and listen to that episode, and it will give you a pretty decent idea of where to start. Make sure you keep the checklist from the show notes there. But we're going to talk specifically about fishing gear here. As you all know, I'm going to say it again. I know you're going to roll your eyes, but I always carry 2 rods and I carry 2 reels, and you should always do the same thing. Because if you hike to a lake and then you break one or something goes wrong, you're going to be real frustrated and have a shitty day. And then I bet you're going to remember to bring a second rod and a second reel the next time. But we're not going to go too far down that rabbit hole this time because I've beaten you over the head with it enough. Instead, we're going to talk about which rods you should bring up to these lakes. And to do that, let's kind of start with the basics of what you're going to be looking at these lakes. They pose a particular challenge because the lakes are very different from one another as far as their structure goes. And because their structure is different, the way that you have to fish them is different. And because the way that you have to fish them is different, you've got to have pretty versatile gear with you. Okay, so some lakes have really wide, narrow shelves sort of up against the bank, which you can stand on the bank. You can cast the shelves to cruisers. We'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. But you don't have to really get in the water. You're making short casts, let's say 20 to 25 feet at the outside toward cruising fish. And it's all good. You can kind of get away with whatever you need. Other lakes are not like that. And you have either very steep drop-offs along the shore, or you have incredibly wide sort of vegetated areas, especially in lower elevation lakes, that can really pose a problem for you because now you have to be able to cast a lot further. You're either going to have to get in the water, which necessitates bringing up wading boots and waders. You can certainly do that. I do on occasion to certain lakes, but just keep in mind that you're going to be carrying those things up a mountain, and a good pair of wading boots, I don't know the exact weight, but I'm guessing they're 3 or 4 pounds dry and even heavier than that wet on the way down. Wading socks, if you're bringing waders, those weigh some. I mean, there's a weight consideration here. And as a result, I don't usually bring them unless I have to. And that means that I have to be prepared to make pretty long casts on a pretty regular basis to get past some of those areas. Maybe it's to clear some kind of debris on the shoreline. Maybe it's just because that's where the fish happen to be and they're living out in that sort of deeper pocket in the middle of the lake, and that's where I see them coming up or doing their thing. Whatever it might be, that's one of the things you have to think about is sort of how your fishing angle changes and how far you have to be able to cast to get to these fish. Another aspect of it is your back cast. Lakes above tree line, you often have a pretty clear back cast because you're standing around in a cirque and there's nothing up there but rocks and tundra and mountain goats. So you might have all the room in the world to make a crazy, flowy, beautiful river runs through it backcast, in which case, rad, right? Go ahead and do that. You've got plenty of room. Other lakes are not like that, though. You could be hemmed in by cliffs. You could be hemmed in by hillsides or vegetation or shrubbery on a hill behind you. It could be trees if you're at tree line or below it. Whatever. There are a lot of reasons that you might not have a full backcast on any given high lake. And that means that you have to think about that too, because that's really a question of how you get your fly out there, right? And because it's a question of how you get your fly out there, it becomes a question of how you want to set up your rig. And then you have one last thing to think about, which is wind. I don't know if you have noticed, but probably if you've ever been on top of a mountain, it's windy pretty much all the time. If it's sunny, it's windy. If it's cloudy, it's windy. If it's raining, it's windy. If it's a thunderstorm, it's windy, and you shouldn't be there. Don't do that. Don't be stupid. But there's almost always wind. And the result of that is that you need to have a rod that's got the backbone to really punch flies through that wind. And that can really limit your choices, especially because a lot of people are sort of locked into this idea that you need a smaller weight rod for smaller fish. And yeah, maybe you're up there chasing hog cutthroat, but let's be real. I mean, a lot of these fish are somewhere between 12 and 18 inches, and you don't need a super heavy rod for those. But when it comes to fishing high alpine lakes, it's not really about the size of the fish. It's about the conditions that you're going to be fishing in. And as a result of that, I tend to carry much heavier rods than you would expect for this stuff. So my default rod for going to high alpine lakes, really anywhere, it's the rod that I always have in my tube, is my 6-weight Orvis Helios D. I love the thing. It is a 6-weight rod, which is really pretty heavy for trout in a lot of cases, but it has the backbone to be able to get flies out pretty far, and it has the ability to do that while loading pretty quickly and getting those things out without having to have a long, flowy, slow action backcast to get that thing out into the water. So that's my primary rod. I always carry a secondary rod, obviously. That secondary rod is usually a 5-weight. Every now and then I will carry a 4-weight instead. If it's a 5-weight, it's my 9-foot, 5-inch Orvis Blackout rod, which I love and is a great stillwater rod. It's also a pretty good big river rod because of the extra reach on it. But I do sometimes also carry a 4-weight, in part because 4-weights are just kind of where my soul lives. It's my favorite weight. I've got far too many of them. I love all of them. But I will often carry a 4-weight with me if I'm going to be fishing a stream on the way up, if I think I might need to fish a stream as a backup, or just as a backup at certain lakes because I don't want to carry a 5-weight for whatever reason. I'm never going to carry a rod that is less than 9 feet long at these lakes. I have attempted to fish 7.5-foot rods there because I thought that maybe the shorter rod would give me extra clearance for a backcast or for maneuvering in the trees along the shoreline. Not really. And in fact, all it really does is limit your casting potential, right? Those rods are made for small creeks and small streams. They're not made for big lakes. They're not made for making long casts. It's just not what they're for. When you use a tool for something other than what it was made to do, you might have a bad time. So as a result, I don't really use those. I use 9 feet and up. I wouldn't be opposed probably to using an even longer rod than that, but I don't as a general rule. And that's kind of my setup. If it's a 4-weight, just so you guys have it, because I know somebody's going to ask me, I'm either using an Orvis Recon 4-weight, which is a great backcountry rod. It's pretty bomb-proof. You can slap it around, smash it on trees, whatever. It's probably not going to break. Or I'm using my more recent favorite, which is a Hardy Aiden 4-weight, which is maybe the most fun and most soulful sort of mid-price fly rod I've ever used. I love that thing. I mean, it is just a trip. It's fun to fish in streams and in lakes. And if both of those aren't with me for whatever reason, I do have an Echo Trout X, which is, I think, one of the most underrated fly rods on the market. It's inexpensive. It's priced a couple $100 less than even the other mid-range rods out there. And it's awesome. It's a little slower than I would like, but it's fun to fish. It's reliable. It comes with an extra tip section, which is actually pretty rad because that's the part that you're probably going to break most of the time. And it's a really good little rod. So those are the 4-weights that I have. I talked about the 5 and the 6-weight already. It's some combination of those in my tube every time I go out to one of these lakes, the 6-weight being my primary rod. because it allows me to cut through the wind and know that I can fish in tougher conditions up there, which is often required when you decide to go fish in the alpine tundra. Now, it's not just about rods, right? Anybody who's been fly fishing for a while knows that while rods are incredibly important to you, it's not the only thing that you need to be thinking about, because you have to be thinking about the behavior of the rod. And that really is a question of fly line, and which fly line you want to bring with you. Now, this is really important because I think a lot of guys underrate the importance of fly line. They think if they get a decent rod, a decent reel, and they know what they're doing, they're going to be fine. And to some extent, that is true. You can make almost any okay-ish fly line work if you know what you're doing. But it's probably not the best tool for the job. And a lot of fly lines, the performance difference between them is remarkable. It's much more than you would think it is. Having the right line on the right rod at the right time for the right situation can be the difference between having an incredible day of success or having an incredibly frustrating day of not being able to make the rod do what you want it to do. And look, there are a lot of reasons not to catch fish. It always kind of sucks. Obviously, we'd like to catch them. But there is no more frustrating way to not catch fish than to have equipment that won't do what you want it to do. Can't make the cast, can't do the thing, can't do the tactic. That is incredibly frustrating, in part because it just sucks to have that happen to you, and in part because it's avoidable. You don't have to let that happen to you. It's kind of your fault if you do it. So you're going to want to get the right kind of fly line on these rods. It's going to depend on the rod. I really recommend that you have a conversation with your local fly shop guys or go online and research it before you pick one. It's tough for me to give you just a very specific line to use, but you're going to want a weight forward line. You're going to want a weight forward floating line probably. And there are some people that will tell you to pack in sink tip or sinking line. I can see where that would be helpful sometimes. So if you want to carry an extra spool with that stuff on it, then fine. But my default is always the weight forward floating, because I might be fishing dry flies. I might be fishing nymphs. I could be doing a whole bunch of stuff, all of which works pretty well in lakes with floating line as long as the fish aren't too deep. And so I tend to stick to that. But whatever kind of line you get, you're going to want to get a line with a really short, aggressive front taper that is designed for a really quick load, because you might not have that back cast, right? You can't really afford to have these long, sweeping 10-2 back casts when you've got a bunch of trees behind you. You need a line that is heavy enough that you can load it up quickly, that you can roll cast it out quickly, and you can get the distance and the power that you need, especially in windy conditions, without getting tangled up and frustrated with, having to make sure that everything is exactly right and you've got a football field behind you to whip 50 feet of line around you. So, you can decide what kind of line that looks like. My 6-weight has Scientific Angler's Mastery MPX on it. It's about a half size heavier for faster loading of the rod. I overline some of my rods. Occasionally I've played around with going a full line size up, but I tend not to do that very often for lake rods. The MPX is a really nice line that works really nicely with my particular selection of rods. If you're not going to use that, then Rio Gold is another good bet. Fairly heavier line, about a half size heavy again, with a nice sort of shooting head on it to help you get it out there. There are a whole bunch of these. I think Airflow's got something like that too. But, go and talk to your fly shop guys and do pay attention to your line, not just as something that is on your reel because it looks cool, but as something that you really need to be right for you if you're going to have the best possible day on an alpine lake. Beyond that, you kind of know what you need here, right? You need your standard fly fishing bag with your nippers, your forceps, your fly boxes. You need some dry fly shake. You need your gink. If you want to dress those dry flies, you probably want to bring some small indicators with you, because unfortunately sometimes indicator nymphing does happen to us on these high alpine lakes, no matter how much we wish it didn't. And all your normal kits. You need all that stuff. And then you need a net. You always need a net. Don't forget your net. If you do, it's kind of, it sucks, because the time that you forget your net will be the time that you catch your monster trophy fish, and you will have no way to take a picture of that fish that is not dragging it up onto the ground and probably killing it, or manhandling it in the water while you splash around in glacial melt, which is not great for your safety or your health. So don't forget your net. Bring that with you too. But that's it. That's all you really need to go up and fly fish these places. There's no special equipment beyond that. You don't have to pack in a belly boat if you want to knock yourself out. I had somebody ask me about that at one point. I have never packed in a belly boat. I don't think I ever want to, because they're heavy and kind of cumbersome. But if you want to, knock yourself out, I'm sure it's fine. Ditto on waders and wading boots. I'd prefer not to, but if I think I'm going to have to get in the water, I will bring at least wading boots and sometimes waders. It really just depends on where you're going. Spend some time researching the lakes, go online, see if there's anything about them. If there's not, then go on to the satellites, right? Take a look at satellite images on Onyx or Google Earth or Copernicus, which we talked about last week, and really try to get a feel for the topography of the lake and the terrain around the lake and the vegetation around the lake, because that will give you a good sense of what you're going to need to fish it and what you should expect when you get there, okay? So that covers you for your fishing gear. That's thing one. Now let's talk about flies. You should bring dries, nymphs, streamers, and wet flies. Okay, we're done. We talked about flies. We can all go. No, I'm just kidding. We'll keep talking about them in a little bit more detail. I'm being kind of snotty, but for real, that's what you want, right? So I always have all 4 of those fly types with me, in part because they're in my 3 fly boxes, and there's no reason to not have them with me since those fly boxes are with me no matter where I am. But I wouldn't leave them at home, right? So don't be the guy that rolls up to a lake and hikes 8 miles and has like 2 elk hair caddis and a hopper. You might do okay, or you might not. Don't be the guy who shows up with the Euro nymphing setup and forgot to pack your dry flies at all. You might do okay, and you might not. And don't be a streamer junkie, guys. I mean, I like fishing streamers, and I especially like fishing streamers in still water. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. But there are some guys who that's all they do in lakes. Like, they forget that you can regular fly fish with a dry dropper or a dry fly or a wet fly or nymphs. And they just want to fish streamers. And if that's your thing, if that makes you happy, then cool. Fish streamers. That's fun. But sometimes it's not going to work. And if you're going to limit your options as far as your fly selection goes here, you're going to eventually run into a day where your fly selection doesn't work, and you're going to be frustrated because not catching fish sucks, like we talked about before. So you need all the different types of flies with you. I'm going to lay out a few specific patterns that I think will be very helpful to you up there, but I'm not going to lay out everything for you, because the truth is that these patterns aren't all that different than what you would fish somewhere else, right? I mean, you're probably not going to fish stoneflies in a lake because stoneflies don't really live in still water. Why? Because their gills don't work unless there's running water. So you're not typically going to see stoneflies in lakes. Therefore, you're probably not going to fish them. But everything else, so caddisflies and mayflies and especially midges, they do live in still water. And that means that all the stuff that you use in running water, it's all still there in the lakes, and you might as well use it. On the dry fly side, I think you can pretty much get away most of the time with 4 patterns, okay? Not saying you should only carry 4 patterns. Being able to carry more and being versatile in case you run into one of those weird Rubik's Cube moments where you can't figure out what the hell's going on, it's always a good idea. But if you had to pick just 4 dry fly patterns, I would go up there with an elk hair caddis. Yes, caddis flies hatch in lakes. It's a little less obvious than it is in rivers, but they're still there. Also, the elk hair caddis doesn't really look like a caddis. It just looks like a bug floating on the surface, and so it does a great job of imitating lots of stuff. A parachute Adams, or some type of wolf pattern to imitate mayflies. A Griffith's net of some kind, preferably tied with some kind of post or wing on it so that you can actually see the damn thing. A lot of these lakes have prolific midge hatches, especially in the mornings and in the evenings. And you'll see, it looks like it's raining because there are so many fish coming up and eating midges as they emerge from the water and making those little ripples every time they do. So having a Griffith's net is good with you. And then hoppers. There are grasshoppers at these high lakes. There are grasshoppers everywhere. And if you have a bunch of lazy fish who are sitting there in cold water who don't want to come up for a size 20 parachute Adams, they might come up for a size 10 hopper pattern that you throw in there. And in fact, I would say a good percentage of my best fish have come on hoppers in High-Alpine lakes. And so that's kind of a must-have pattern. You can decide what kind of hopper pattern you want to bring. I tie something called the GFA hopper. It's the General Foam Attractor hopper. It's kind of a silly name, but here it is. Describes it pretty well. They are just incredibly simple flies. Just a few materials. They take just a couple of minutes to tie. They're not the prettiest hopper pattern or the most complicated hopper pattern or the most realistic hopper pattern, but they work just fine. And so I tie those things by the dozens and dozens and dozens over the warmer months, both for streams and for lakes. Customize them a little bit. Keep in mind that they ride pretty low in the water, and so if you are fly tying, or even if you're buying them, you want to be able to have some type of a colored piece of foam or a colored yarn wing or something on the fly, even if it's just some elk hair on top, to help with visibility, because they ride pretty low, and when you get some glare on the water, it can be tough to see them. But make sure that you always have those with you. On the nymph side, things get pretty simple here. I find that the same nymphs that you would use in a regular stream are going to work pretty well for you in lakes. Now, I think there's an outsized focus on midges, so your zebra midges, your top secret midges, all of that stuff are going to work great here, and those are things that you want to have in your box. I also use prince nymphs in lakes to great effect. I use my flirty dirt bag, which is I'd hate to say patented because it's far too ugly and sloppy to be patented, but it's a sort of beadhead nymph wet fly thing with peacock herl that fish eat everywhere I throw it. I don't know what it looks like, but they love it. I'll post a picture of that on Instagram one of these days so you guys can take a look at it. But I carry that with me on a regular basis. I will use hare's ears in these lakes on a regular basis. There's just a whole bunch of stuff. I don't think you need to get too fancy with your nymphs. Now, I don't think that you necessarily want Euro nymphs on there, so I'm not sure you want to be throwing a perdigon in the lake. I mean, I guess it might work, but I've never really tried it. And also, I tend to be fishing dry dropper pretty often if I have a nymph on there, and real heavy sinking nymphs aren't going to do great for you, right? So, those perdigons are probably out. The Pat's rubber legs, I mean, you might find a fish willing to eat them, but like we talked about earlier, there really aren't stoneflies in lakes most of the time, so they're not really the best bet. Those kind of small nymphs are where it's at. And just like in moving water, I really don't ever fish nymphs bigger than an 18. I know there are guys out there fishing like 12s and 14s. I think that's crazy, at least for the places that I've been. There just aren't really that many bugs that size. Could there be? Sure. Maybe you find a size 14 scud floating around down there somewhere. I'm not saying it can't happen. Scuds is another pattern, by the way, that you probably should have with you, since they're a pretty big part of the diet for some of these fish at certain lakes. But in general, I think smaller is better, right? So I would say absolutely never any bigger than a 16. I really don't fish anything bigger than an 18. And more often than not, especially in a dry dropper setup, that nymph is going to be a size 20, because I think fish are predisposed to eating smaller bugs. It's what they're used to. And the smaller bugs are less likely to drag my rig down and make me have a bad time trying to fish it. So bring your regular nymphs, make sure they're small enough. Beadheads are fine. I think they still outfish non-beadhead flies most of the time in lakes. So feel free to bring those with you. I throw them all the time. But regular old nymphs in your regular nymph box will do just fine here. When it comes to streamers, you need a whole box of these things. I mean, I'm just kidding, you need one streamer, and it's a black woolly bugger. That's all you need. If you want to bring other streamers, you can. You can bring green woolly buggers. You can bring white woolly buggers. You could bring little mini Klausers, which I've tied up before. You can bring whatever you want, but I'm going to tell you that you really just need woolly buggers. That's pretty much it. I will occasionally throw a balanced leech underneath an indicator, so it doesn't hurt to have a few of those balanced leech patterns in your box, but those aren't really streamers. And to be honest, I'm not totally sure that things are pretty desperate if I'm breaking those out, because I've run out of ideas. So black woolly buggers are pretty much all you need. I tie them in size 10. I don't really tie them in other sizes. I don't feel that I need to. I put a little bit of flash in the tail, black marabou, and then black chenille and the wire wrap with a black bead head to help them sink and kind of dive and do that undulating pattern that drives fish crazy. I think that's probably all you need. Go up with a dozen or so black woolly buggers and you're probably good for streamers. And then you've got your wet flies. And wet flies are like almost a forgotten art, I feel. I mean, very few people really fish them anymore. I almost never hear anybody talking about fishing wet flies. And to be honest with you, I don't really fish them very often, at least not in stream settings. But in lakes, they can be incredibly effective, especially if they are tied behind a streamer. And again, we'll talk more about this here when we get to the tactics part. But it is worth bringing some wet flies with you. You can decide which flies you want. I don't usually put bead heads on these, flirty dirt bag being a slight exception. But it kind of serves dual purposes, I guess. I don't usually put a bead on them, and I tie something called the Lyson Ring Spider. I hope I'm saying the guy's name right. His name was Lyson Ring, I think. And it's just this super, like, bare bones, dubbing, ribbing, soft tackle wet fly. That's all it is. It's not hard to tie. It only takes a few minutes. And fish go crazy for them. I catch a ton of fish in these lakes on those wet flies. And so you want to have at least a dozen or so of those with you. I don't think you need a whole bunch of different patterns. I don't know that you need a whole bunch of different colors. I mean, I tie mine in like kind of an olive and then sort of a burnt orange. They both work. I don't know that one works better than the other. I have trouble believing that tying them in another color would make much of a difference, but I mean, you experiment and find out what you want. But don't forget the wet flies, because you might need those with you too. And I think that kind of covers us for flies. If you want to bring up some other pattern, rad. If you want to tie your own pattern, cool. But I think the big takeaway is you need at least a few basic patterns for dries and nymphs in particular that imitate mayflies, caddisflies, and midges, because those are the things that fish are most likely eating. But some small streamers that look like leeches or bait fish, also going to work for you. And wet flies that look like nondescript bug things swimming around the lake, those are going to work pretty well for you too. So make sure that you have at least a few of those with you. All right. So that's it for flies. Let's talk about tactics. And I'm going to have to condense this at least a little bit because there's a lot to talk about. And I don't think you guys want to listen to me talk for hours on end. So I'm going to do my best to keep it limited to a few really critical things. Let's start with how you find fish. Okay. So finding fish in lakes is really kind of the hardest part of fishing any lake, but especially high lakes. This is the hardest part. And you kind of have a couple of different options here, right? The first one is that you can just show up and look for fish, right? Use your Mark 1 legs and your Mark 1 eyeballs, walk around on the shore and look for cruising fish. You will very often find fish cruising in the shallows. The water's warmer there. There's more insect activity there. So you'll find fish kind of cruising the shallows, especially cutthroat. But also brookies, depending on where you happen to be. And so you can just walk around and sight fish. And I do a lot of this with lakes. I mean, these lakes are pretty big. You know, as we talked about last week, you may not get a lot of time on them before the weather blows you off. So big lake plus only really a couple or 3 hours to fish plus elevation and everything else. You don't really have time to sit there and like sit on a Home Depot bucket and hope for the best, right? And fish your way around the lake. You need to be more deliberate about it than that. And so walking around and just looking for fish is the first thing that you always can do. But if you can't do that, you can use the lake's structure and the sort of general makeup of these lakes to help you figure it out. Now, let me give you a really quick science lesson about lakes. And there are different kinds of lakes, right? You have oligotrophic lakes, which are really cold, really clear, and really deep. Not a lot of nutrients, not a lot going on in there, but they do have lots of oxygen, and they can be a little bit tougher to find fish in because there just isn't a lot of stuff going on. And unfortunately, this is what most high alpine lakes are. Then you have mesotrophic lakes. These are pretty good balance, right? So still kind of rocky, but they have pretty decent nutrients in them. They have quite a bit of plant life, more bugs, and they often fish great. So these are kind of your lower elevation lakes. I would say these are like your tree line and below lakes that kind of fall into this category. And then you have the eutrophic lakes. These are shallow lakes, low elevation, warm water, tons of plant growth. Usually there's algae in them. And these are really not trout lakes, right? So we don't really need to think about them. These are usually like warm water lakes where you're looking for bass or panfish or something else. And then you have other stuff like reservoirs, but we're not really going to talk about big reservoirs today, so you can leave that one alone. But no matter what kind of lake you're fishing, you kind of know some things about it, right? The first thing that you know is that almost every lake, maybe every lake, I don't know, scientists out there, marine biologists, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but essentially every lake has 3 different zones to it, okay? There's the profundal zone. That's the big, deep, dark section out in the middle of the lake where the water's cold and it's deep. There's not a lot of plant life out there. Not a lot of light can penetrate through the water down to the bottom. And as a result, it's kind of a dead zone, but fish will use it to hide from predators. That's probably not where you want to fish, right? You probably don't need to be way, way deep in a lot of these lakes. Then you have the limnetic zone, which is sort of your open water zone. This is slightly deeper water, like that first drop off away from shore. It's more of the lake body, I would say. It's not the deepest part, the profundal zone, but it is a deep part of the lake. There may be trout hanging out in there. They're probably eating things like midges that are coming off in there. And they're sort of cruising those drop-offs between the shallower water, which we'll talk about here in a second, and this limnetic water where there's less plant life, less insect activity, but you might still find fish kind of darting back between them. And then you have sort of the Goldilocks zone in most lakes, which is called the littoral zone. This is like the shoreline. So those shallow shorelines that I mentioned earlier, these are littoral zones. And this is important because this is where most of the life in these lakes is. The water is shallower, which means that more sunlight can penetrate down to the bottom. That means more insect activity. It means more plant life. It means more life in general. The water tends to be warmer, which can help with the same things that I just talked about, but also keeping the trout a little bit more active. And this is where you're going to find most of your fish cruising and feeding actively. Now, you may find some in that deeper sort of zone 2 limnetic zone, but you're probably going to find most of them in the littoral zone along the shoreline. Okay, and so you know that out of the gate that you probably don't need to be throwing massive 70-foot casts in the middle of the lake most of the time. Now, there are some exceptions to this, of course. There are always exceptions to everything. Some lakes are so shallow around the edges that the fish don't have anywhere to hide from birds or predators or anything else. And so they go and sort of, it's like I don't know the right analogy. It's like a very shallow soup bowl, right? Where they don't really want to hang around the lip of the bowl. They want to go into that deeper section in the middle of the bowl where they can be safer and more covered. So this can vary from time to time, but most of the time you're going to be looking for them close to the shore. And that means, as we mentioned earlier, you're going to want to be walking around the shoreline looking for fish cruising. Pay attention to what they're doing, right? So if they're cruising as like a big pod of fish, they might not be feeding. In fact, depending on the timing, going back to last week's episode, if you're seeing a whole bunch of them kind of schooling together and chasing each other in the shallows, that might mean, especially if they're cutthroat, that they are attempting to spawn. And that might mean that you're going to have a really hard day because those fish, even though they really can't spawn successfully in still water, they think they can. And as a result, they're really not interested in eating. They've got other stuff on their minds. So pay attention to what the fish are doing and pay attention to what the lake is telling you, right? So when you get there, you're going to see those little ripples of fish coming up and eating. You might see fish coming all the way out of the water like crazy people chasing caddis or whatever. But pay attention to where the fish are and look for clues for where they're going to be. And if you can use your eyes to sort of figure that out, knowing this sort of basic structure of the lake, that's going to put you well ahead of the game. So you're not just the guy who shows up with a fly rod and starts randomly casting because why the hell not? And I know you might shake your head at this, but a lot of these lakes, when you first get there, they're kind of formless, right? They don't have the same structure or character that a stream does. They're just big bodies of water. And if you don't really know what you're looking for, you don't really know what you're looking at, they can be pretty intimidating to fish. I know I had a really hard time when I first started doing high lakes because I just didn't know where to start. Right? It's just a big open piece of water. I'm like, well, shit, I have no idea where I should put this thing. You need to kind of have some baseline knowledge, and I think this will probably help you with that. The other thing that will help you with that is understanding that trout, even in lakes, really like moving water. They like current. That helps oxygenate the water. It carries food to them from the stream up above. It provides them with an easier time on their gills. It's for a lot of reasons, trout like being in that moving water in lakes. And so very often, one of the best places to fish is either in the outlet of the lake where the water actually flows out of the lake into a stream below, which creates kind of a suction effect and creates some current and almost a little mini stream section there at the mouth of the lake that can be worth fishing, but especially the inlets. And in fact, I spend a great deal of my time when I am planning these trips looking at maps and trying to figure out if the inlet is accessible. It's not to say you can't catch fish in the rest of the lake, but you really, if you can get to the inlet, if it's not cliffed out, if it's not a waterfall, if there's not too much snow, it all depends on which cirque you're fishing, which lake you're fishing, how it's oriented, how much sun it gets. There's a lot here. But if you can get to the inlet, you're probably going to have a great time. I have had days where I get to the inlet of a lake and there are like 300 fish. No joke. It's like a National Geographic special stacked up in that moving current. And they will just eat all day. I had one particular lake, I won't name it here, but just stacked with brook trout in that inlet. And I would throw a fly in and one would eat it. I'd pull them out and let them take a picture, put them back. I must have caught 60 fish out of that inlet. No joke. And it never deterred any of them. They didn't really run away. They just kept doing their thing. And I mean, it can be ridiculous fishing in those inlets if you can get to them. Even if it's not ridiculous fishing, it's probably going to be pretty decent. It's going to give you a good shot at fish. So inlets are a really good place to start. Keep in mind that a lot of lakes have more than one inlet. They could have one big inlet, which is kind of where the creek from above and all the glacial snowmelt comes in, or they could have a whole bunch of different trickles coming in. There's some lakes that have 5 or 6 different inlets from a whole bunch of different creeks coming into them. Sometimes it's an obvious inlet that looks like a river flowing into a lake, and that's cool. Sometimes the stream up above sort of levels out into a marsh or a wetland, and then you have a 100-yard delta coming into the lake. Which is a little bit hard to fish because you're having to wade in muck and mud and vegetation to be able to get to a place where you can get your line out there. But really pay attention to the inlets, because that's when you're having a tough time. If you're not finding them, that's a good place to be, just to sort of give yourself a fighting chance. And then also the drop-offs, right? So I talked about this a little bit earlier, but that drop-off between the limnetic zone and the littoral zone, where it goes from shallow to deep, fish hang there all the time because they can come in, eat out of the littoral zone, get a couple quick bites in that warmer water, and then if something happens, an eagle flies overhead or something spooks them, they can dart right back out into that deeper water. So those drop-offs, anytime you see a cliff or a step or anything like that, that's a good place to be fishing, even if you don't see the fish, because sometimes they will just rocket up out of the depths of those drop-offs and smash your fly, even though you can't really see them. So keep that piece of structural knowledge in your mind as well. And then we should also talk about wind when it comes to being on these lakes. Wind matters for where the fish are located, because wind moves water and water moves food. So in general, you're going to want to fish on the windward side of a lake, okay? And that is the side where the wind is blowing into your face. And I know that seems counterintuitive. You really want to go out and throw with the wind at your back so you can get those long casts. But when the wind is blowing into your face, number one, it's creating current, which is encouraging those fish to move toward the far shore, but it's also moving food. And so you think about if you threw like a bunch of puffballs into a bathtub and then put a fan on the bathtub, what would happen? Well, all the puffballs would congregate on whatever windward side of the bathtub the fan happened to be blowing to. It's the same in lakes, and it's the same with bugs. So when that wind is really going, it's going to push the food toward the windward shore. And that means you probably want to be fishing with your face in the wind. Yeah, I know it's tough for casting. Yes, I know it's not the most fun. I know it kind of goes against your instincts, but I'm telling you, that is the trick to being where the fish are. So keep that one in mind too. And I think that pretty much covers us for the basic geography of finding fish in these lakes. So let's talk a little bit about the actual tactics of fishing them. And I'm going to skip over some of these and move pretty quickly, because you kind of already know how to do them, and we can talk more about them at a later date. But I do want to take time to talk about a couple of little tricks of the trade that I have here. So first things first, I usually start with the dry dropper. I just do. I love dry droppers. It's what I fish most of the time. I'm sure people will say that I'm uncreative, but I'm okay with being uncreative and catching a bunch of fish. Lakes really aren't that different, except for the fact that you're not having to worry as much about drift, and you're probably fishing a longer dropper. So I usually start with the GFA hopper up top. Hoppers do great in these lakes. You can try a beetle, you can try an ant, you can try another terrestrial if you want, but I usually start with something big and juicy enough to entice a fish to come up from those depths and grab it, or to pull off their cruising route and come get it. And then I will also put a regular old dropper on there, Prince nymph for a flirty dirt bag, or a zebra midge, or whatever happens to be hanging down there. The difference is that the dropper is usually longer, right? So in a stream, I would probably fish something like let's say 12 to 20 inch dropper, depending on how deep the stream is. In a lake, I might be fishing a 2 or 2.5 or even 3 foot dropper, because I'm really trying to dangle that fly down into that mid column where some of the fish might be. So that's really the only difference. Otherwise, it looks exactly the same. If you happen to be fishing the inlet, then you are fishing current, and you're basically just fishing a dry dropper, and you're going to catch a lot of fish doing that. So that's thing one. Thing two is dry fly fishing straight up. You can do a single dry, you can do 2 dries, whatever you want to do. I very often will use 2 dries if I have to fish a Griffith's gnat, because they're so damn hard to see. So I will put a bigger, bushier, more visible fly like a Parachute Adams or a Royal Wolf up front, Griffith's gnat attached to that, and then at least I have some visual marker of where I think the fly is. And if I see a fish come up for something behind it, I assume it's a Griffith's gnat. I set the hook. Not 100%, but it can work for you. Keep in mind that double dries, they can be a lot of fun. They can also be kind of frustrating because you spend a lot of time doing dry fly shake and just trying to get things laid out the way that you want them to. But double dry with like let's say a 12-inch leash on the second dry is usually an okay bet. You can also fish a single dry and be kind of old school about it. You can fish nymphs if you want to. Some guys indicator nymph these lakes. I will occasionally do it, but I hate it with a fiery passion. It is the closest thing to fishing a worm under a bobber that you can possibly get in fly fishing. And it is so dull that unless I absolutely have to, and I believe that that's the only way to get a fish, I'm probably not going to do that. But if you want to do it, knock yourself out. The more interesting way to fish nymphs is not with a static indicator where they're just hanging there and you're relying on the current to move them, but it's with stripping. And you can do that with an indicator. You can strip the indicator back and that'll pull the nymphs back to you in the mid column or whatever depth you've set up. You can not use an indicator and throw those things out there and strip them basically like streamers. A lot of people don't really think about that, but that allows them to get deeper, closer to the bottom. And if you get the strip right, it really does look like bugs swimming around on the lower part of the lake. And those can do really, really well. You can twitch them, and you can twitch them under a dry fly. I should mention that too. I, shockingly enough, occasionally have incredible success putting an elk hair caddis out and sinking it deliberately under the water with a nymph hanging off the back, and then just giving it short, sharp twitches in the water. I don't know why that works exactly, but the fish will come and eat the dry fly even underwater while I am twitching it through the column, or they might eat the nymph or whatever. But you can twitch nymphs and sunken dries, and you'll do surprisingly well with them, even though it kind of goes against fly fishing dogma, I guess, to deliberately sink your dry. So don't forget about stripping nymphs. That'll work for you sometimes when a lot of things don't. And then you've got sort of my fallback, right? So like if I don't know what's going on, if I don't see any bugs hatching, I don't see a lot of fish activity, I'm not really exactly sure what to do, then I use what I call the BSW, okay? This is a patented Rossism. I'm sure that no one in the world has ever thought of anything like this, and so therefore I'm going to take credit for it. Just kidding. I'm sure I'm not the only person who does this, but I will take a black woolly bugger. I'll tie it on. I'm going to put a quick plug in here. I don't change my leader for this, guys. I don't. I know some of you are going to say that that's wrong or anathema, and I'm supposed to change out my leader for this, that, or the other. I don't. I use the same fly line and the same leader at the same length for all of this stuff, and it works just fine for me. I might tie on more terminal tippet to one rig or less on another, but for the most part, it's all the same. That's true of the streamer too. So I will literally cut off my dry fly, tie a black woolly bugger onto 5X tippet off my tippet ring, and then I will tie onto the black woolly bugger. That's the B, by the way. Bugger. B for bugger. Then I will tie on a scud. And this is usually a size 16 or 18 scud. I tie a scud pattern that I call the trash scud because it's literally made out of garbage. I tie it with some dubbing and then some old fly line and some cut up Ziploc bags for the shell casing. It's ridiculous. It's like a poor person's fly, which not that there's anything wrong with that, but it catches a lot of fish. So check that one out too if you want. Scuds, as I mentioned, can be a very important source of food for these fish, so don't rule them out. That is the S for scud. And then there's the W, which is the wet fly. And the wet fly is, as I mentioned earlier, that license ring spider. And I will tie that off the back of the scud. And so when I have the whole BSW going, I have a black woolly bugger, probably a size 10. Then I have like a size 16 to 18 trash scud tied to that. And then about, let's say 10 to 12 inches behind it. And then 10 to 12 inches behind that, all of this is with 5X. I am tying on my license ring spider or my wet fly. And I will fish this exactly like a streamer rig. So I will throw the streamer out into the water. I'll get all sorts of different looks, drag it along the shoreline, go out and back into you, do angles, just cover water with it. And I find that I pick up a incredible amount of fish with this rig. Sometimes they eat the bugger, sometimes they eat the scud. Most often they eat that trailing wet fly. But in any case, these do really, really well. And if you want sort of that one rig to rule them all, like you show up to a lake and you just don't know what the hell to do, throwing this rig, the BSW rig, is probably going to save a lot of days for you because it is my fallback. I usually start with the dry dropper, like I said, but if it's not working, if I'm not seeing much, I'm going to the BSW. And the BSW very rarely disappoints. Sometimes it disappoints. I'm not going to say it's 100%, but it's pretty good and it's pretty reliable. So keep that in mind. One caveat. Keep in mind, you're probably casting into the wind, okay, with 3 flies on your line, and you're having to do it with limited back cast behind you because you probably have trees or rocks or whatever back there. You need to be careful about your casting form here, or you are going to tangle it. 3 flies is an invitation to a tangle. There's really no way around it. I mean, you can drop one if you want to, but I think that really you just need to make sure your casting mechanics are right. Roll cast if you have to. Just be careful with it. But keep in mind that the one trade-off there is that you do have 3 flies on it. Streamers are already kind of cumbersome to cast, especially at the end of long leaders. And so you just need to be sort of aware of the fact that you might wind up with some tangles if you're not being careful. But tangles are a small price to pay for catching those fish. And so I hope that one really works for you. And really, that kind of wraps us up, guys. We could talk about this for hours, like I said. And we will probably talk about it in more detail at some point. Feel free to send me your questions. Give me a shout wherever you want. I'm always happy to talk more offline or online about this stuff. But I'm hoping that this at least gives you a sense of how to get fish to happen for you at High-Alpine lakes. Because a lot of guys don't. They get frustrated. They give up on them. And that's a real shame because even though they are different than moving water, and even though in my soul I think I'm a moving water, small creek guy, these lakes are really special. They're beautiful places. They're incredible places to visit and see and touch. And it is a shame when people get frustrated because they just didn't quite know how to handle it and it was a totally different type of fly fishing than they were used to, and they give up and go home. So I don't want that to be you. I want you to go up there. I want you to have a bunch of success. I hope your hiking boots are real dirty. I hope you are staying on the water as much as you possibly can. And I hope you're having an awesome summer so far. And because I might have missed you on the 4th, I hope you also had an awesome 4th of July. So thanks for listening, guys. Have fun out there. Go hit those lakes. See you back here real soon. Till next time, this is Ross. Maybe I'll see you out there. Better be fishing that BSW.